The hollow thud of freezing dirt hitting a small wooden box is a sound that alters your cellular structure. I'm Allison Perez. I am 32 years old. It was March 14th, 2:15 in the afternoon, in a sprawling cemetery in Milford, Connecticut. The wind off the Long Island Sound carried a bitter chill, but I barely felt it. I stood rigid at the edge of a fresh grave, staring at the tiny mahogany casket holding my 4-month-old son, Leo. Then came the smell. Sharp, expensive vanilla perfume cutting through the scent of raw earth and winter pine. My older sister, Jessica, stepped up to my right shoulder. Her designer leather boots sank half an inch into the cemetery mud. I watched her jaw tighten with brief irritation before she smoothed her features into a mask of televised mourning. She leaned in close to my ear, her breath warm against my freezing skin. "We just got a golden retriever puppy this morning," she whispered. Her tone held a strange, bright edge. "We named him Leo, to keep the name alive." She pulled back and pressed the corner of a monogrammed handkerchief to her eye, tapping exactly at the edge of her tear duct to ensure her expensive eyeliner remained pristine. She cast a quick glance at our mother, Cynthia, standing a few feet away. My mother gave a slow, approving nod. I need to pause right here. If you have ever had someone look you in the eye and use your deepest pain as a prop for their own saintly image, you know the exact weight of this silence. Drop your age in the comments and let me know if you are listening, because here on Savage Revenge Stories, we know that true betrayal rarely comes from a stranger. It comes from the people standing right next to you in your darkest hour. I did not scream. I did not fall to the ground and weep. I looked at the dark soil resting on my son. Then I looked at Jessica, draped in a tailored wool coat, performing her tragedy for the shivering relatives gathered behind us. I turned my back on her. I walked away from the grave without issuing a single syllable. My mother called my name. "Allison, where are you going?" It was not a question of concern. It was a reprimand, sharp and inconvenienced. I kept walking. My heels slipped in the wet grass until I reached the asphalt path and found my Honda Civic. I slid into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking the cold air and my family outside. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles stark white against the dark plastic. I turned the key. I did not type my home address into the GPS. I typed in an address for a glass-walled law firm in downtown Hartford. Jessica thought naming a dog after my dead child was a clever, sentimental cover story. I knew the truth. It was a calculated business transaction, and I was going to make sure the final bill left her with nothing. The drive from Milford up Interstate 91 to Hartford took exactly 47 minutes. I know this because my eyes kept darting to the digital clock on the dashboard of my Honda Civic, watching the bright red numbers tick by. My heater was running on high, blasting dry air against my face, trying to thaw the graveyard chill that had seeped into my bones. Every time I blinked, I saw the wet, dark dirt. Every time I inhaled, I smelled that sickening vanilla perfume. I parked in a concrete garage beneath a towering glass structure. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending into a different atmosphere. The air up there was filtered and odorless. The reception area of Sterling & Associates was an expanse of polished white marble and brushed steel. A young woman at the front desk offered me sparkling water. I declined. I just stood there, still wearing the black wool dress I had put on at dawn to bury my child, tracking faint smears of cemetery mud onto their immaculate corporate carpets. At 3:45, attorney David Sterling opened his heavy oak door. He was a man in his late 50s, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my vehicle. He took one look at my pale face and my dark clothes, and his expression shifted into that familiar, suffocating shape of professional pity. Lawyers who work with family estates see grief every day, but they rarely see it fresh from the burial ground. He extended a hand, ushering me into an office that smelled of expensive leather and lemon polish. "Please, sit down," "Mrs. Perez," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a practiced, soothing register. He moved a boutique box of tissues across the glass desk toward me. "Take your time. Tell me what happened today." I did not reach for the tissues. I reached into my black leather tote bag. I pulled out my checkbook, unclicked a ballpoint pen, and wrote out a check for $5,000. I slid the rectangular slip of paper across the smooth glass until it touched the edge of his silver keyboard. Sterling looked at the numbers, then back up at me, his brow furrowing. "I do not usually accept a retainer before we discuss the parameters of a case," he said slowly. "That is the money I saved from my medical billing salary over the last 2 years," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "That was my son Leo's college fund. He does not need it anymore. I need you to take it." Sterling leaned back in his chair. The pity in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. He realized he was not dealing with a hysterical woman seeking emotional validation. He was dealing with a client who had a very specific objective. "What are we pursuing, Allison?" I reached into my bag a second time and withdrew a folded, crumpled photocopy of a legal document. It was 70 pages long, bound by a single rusted staple. I placed it on the desk next to the check. It was my late grandfather's estate trust, drafted in 1998. My grandfather was a man who built a regional logistics empire from nothing. He was also a man obsessed with legacy, with his name, and with the old-fashioned notion of carrying a bloodline forward. He died a decade ago, leaving a complex web of investments and a very specific set of instructions that my mother, Cynthia, had spent years trying to navigate. I opened the document, flipping past the standard distribution schedules and the property deeds, until I reached page 12. I tapped my index finger against section 4. "Read that," I instructed. Sterling adjusted his silver-rimmed reading glasses. He picked up the page. He read in silence for a moment before his lips parted slightly. "The trust dictates a $450,000 disbursement," he read aloud, his voice losing its practiced calm. "An automatic payout from the primary holding account, payable to the firstborn male heir carrying the Leo namesake upon the presentation of a valid birth certificate to the executor." "That is correct," I said. I named my son Leo, not for the money, but because he was my grandfather, too. My son was born 4 months ago. The paperwork for the trust claim takes a minimum of 90 days to process. The disbursement was scheduled to clear by the end of this month. Sterling took off his glasses. "And your son just passed away." "Yes," I said. My chest tightened, a familiar physical ache radiating outward from my ribs. But I forced the air into my lungs. He passed away. And this morning, while I was standing over his grave watching the casket being lowered into the ground, my older sister whispered in my ear that she bought a golden retriever puppy today. She named the dog Leo. Sterling stared at me. For a moment, the high-priced attorney seemed genuinely at a loss for words. He blinked, processing the audacity of the statement. "She named a dog after your deceased infant at his funeral. That is incredibly cruel. Allison, but emotional cruelty is not a tort. People do strange, awful things when they grieve. Sometimes they think they are honoring the dead. She is not honoring anyone," I said. "She is executing a transaction." To understand Jessica, you have to understand the architecture of the Perez family. We grew up in a sprawling colonial house in Westport, a town where social currency is the only currency that matters. My mother, Cynthia, was the architect of our public image. In Cynthia's world, there was only room for one star, and Jessica was cast in the leading role from birth. Jessica was the homecoming queen, the real estate agent with the perfect smile, the woman who married a wealthy property developer and wore diamond tennis bracelets to Sunday brunch. Her trophies and framed magazine clippings dominated the mantelpiece in my mother's living room. My school photos were kept in a drawer in the hallway telephone table. I was the quiet one, the medical billing specialist who made a modest salary and lived in a modest apartment. When I got pregnant by a man who packed his bags and vanished the moment the test turned positive, my mother treated my pregnancy like a clerical error. Your sister just shines brighter. Cynthia used to tell me, adjusting Jessica's collar while ignoring my presence in the room, do not stand in her light. It confuses people. Leo was my redemption. For the first time in my life, I had something pure. I had a family of my own, a boy who looked at me like I was the center of his universe. But my son's existence threatened Jessica's monopoly on our mother's attention. Worse, it threatened her monopoly on the family finances. Jessica and her husband lived a lavish lifestyle, but they were cash poor. They needed liquidity. Jessica had been vocal about remaining child-free her entire life. She was never going to produce an heir. I leaned forward, pressing my hands flat against the cool glass of Sterling's desk. My sister did not buy a dog today because she was sad. She bought a golden retriever and named it Leo because she knows my son's trust disbursement is currently sitting in legal purgatory. The money is scheduled to be released to a Leo Perez. If the primary heir dies, the trust has a maintenance clause, allowing funds to be redirected to a namesake if the executor deems it in the spirit of the grandfather's wishes. Sterling sat back, the puzzle pieces clicking together in his mind. The air in the room grew heavy. He looked at the check, then at the 1998 document, and finally at me. She is going to present the dog to the trust administrator. She is going to claim she established a maintenance trust for an animal to keep the legacy alive. She is going to steal my dead baby's inheritance, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet ringing off the marble walls. She and my mother are going to use a dog to drain $450,000 from a dead child. Sterling let out a slow, sharp breath. He tapped his pen against the desk. It is a brilliant, sickening loophole, he admitted. If she can convince the executor that the dog was purchased to honor the grandfather's wishes, she might legally get away with redirecting those funds. It is a gray area in probate law. But Allison, there is a severe problem here. I waited. The silence in the office was dense. Emotional abuse is a family matter, Sterling said, leaning in close, his eyes locking onto mine. But defrauding an estate trust is a felony. The issue is proof. Right now, all you have is a cruel comment made at a cemetery. A judge will look at that and see a grieving aunt making a tasteless gesture. Knowing she intends to commit fraud and proving she intends to commit fraud are two very different things. Sterling folded his hands over the document. How does a grieving mother prove her sister is a thief without a single piece of hard evidence? I sat in the center of the nursery. The walls were painted a pale, muted green, a shade chosen months ago to project tranquility. Now, it served only as a cold backdrop for an empty crib. I did not sit in the upholstered rocking chair. I sat on the hardwood floor. My spine pressed hard against the plaster wall. I needed the physical discomfort to ground me. The room held a distinct, suffocating scent. It was a heavy, sweet blend of dried milk formula and lavender baby lotion. The smell clung to the fabric of the glider, trapped in the woven threads, a lingering ghost of a life cut devastatingly short. The silence in my apartment was dense. It pressed against my eardrums, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, rhythmic beeping of the hospital machines that had been my entire world for the past few months. I closed my eyes and let the quiet wrap around me. I was not crying. The tears had burned out days ago, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. My phone vibrated against the floorboards near my knee. The harsh mechanical buzz shattered the stillness. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID read, Sarah Jenkins. Sarah was a veteran neonatal intensive care nurse at Westport General Hospital. She was the woman who had stood beside me for 36 straight hours during the worst days of my life. When the medical monitors attached to my son began to sound that final, piercing flatline, Sarah did not offer hollow platitudes. She did not avert her gaze. She placed her steady gloved hand over mine and held it there until the attending physician called the time of death. She was a professional who dealt in harsh realities, a woman who understood the fragile line between fighting for breath and letting go. I swiped the screen to answer and brought the receiver to my ear. I expected a soft check-in, a polite inquiry about my well-being. That is not what I received. "Allison," Sarah said. Her voice was clipped and low, carrying the hushed urgency of someone speaking from a hospital supply closet with the door pulled shut. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen very carefully." I did not speak. I simply held my breath, the phone pressed tight against my skin. "Your sister came into the ward," Sarah continued. "She bypassed the main reception desk and cornered me near the sterile scrub station. She demanded a certified copy of Leo's birth certificate. I stared at the pristine folded swaddles stacked neatly on the changing table. The timeline of the past week twisted in my mind, reordering itself into a new, terrifying shape. "When?" I asked. The word tasted like ash in my mouth. "Tuesday afternoon," Sarah replied, 2 days before Leo passed away. The temperature in the nursery seemed to plummet. My fingers tightened around the phone until my knuckles ached. 2 days before my son took his last agonizing breath. While I was sitting in a plastic chair beside a glowing incubator, praying for a medical miracle, my own sister was walking the hospital corridors, hunting for administrative paperwork. "She told me it was for a memory book," Sarah said, her tone dripping with quiet disgust. "She claimed your mother was putting together a scrapbook to comfort you, and they needed the official footprint and the certificate for the first page. She was dressed in pristine white tennis clothes. She kept checking her watch like my presence was delaying her schedule. I visualized the scene perfectly. Jessica, radiating impatience, wielding our mother's name like a hall pass to extract what she wanted from the hospital staff. I told her hospital policy strictly restricts the release of official vital documents to the biological parents," Sarah explained. She did not handle the rejection well. She threatened to call the hospital administrator on his personal cell phone. She made sure to mention that her husband was a major financial donor to the pediatric wing. So I did what I always do when an entitled visitor tries to bypass protocol and intimidate my staff. I logged the interaction. I listened to the faint hum of the hospital ventilation system through the phone line, waiting for Sarah to finish. I recorded her name, the exact time of the altercation, and her specific request for the birth certificate in the secure hospital visitor registry, Sarah said. I thought her behavior was strange and insensitive then, but after my shift today, another nurse showed me the social media posts your sister made this morning, the photos of the new puppy. It stopped being strange, Allison. It became something else entirely. The puzzle pieces locked together in my mind with a sickening snap. Attorney Sterling's words from yesterday echoed in my ears. To initiate the $450,000 payout from my grandfather's trust, the executor required proof of life. They needed a birth certificate validating the name Leo Perez to open the file. Jessica could not submit a veterinary record to trigger the initial claim. A dog's paperwork would be flagged and rejected by the financial firm's automated screening process. She needed the human document. She needed my son's birth certificate to establish the account. Once the trust file was open and the human infant was officially registered as the primary beneficiary, she could use the tragic death as a pivot point. She would introduce the dog later, presenting the animal to the executor as a namesake maintenance trust, blending the two identities in the confusion and chaos of mourning. The purchase of the golden retriever was not an opportunistic whim at the cemetery. The dog was not a last-minute, tone-deaf coping mechanism. Jessica had orchestrated the financial theft while my son was still connected to a ventilator. She had calculated the exact paperwork required to steal his inheritance and marched into the intensive care unit to harvest it. "Sarah," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any tremor, "can you access that visitor log right now?" Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. It is permanently coded into the digital registry. No one can alter or delete the entry without leaving an unerasable information technology footprint. Print it, I instructed. Print the screen showing her demand, the exact timestamp, and your official refusal. Sign your name at the bottom and date it in blue ink. Keep the paper locked in your personal locker until I come to retrieve it. Do not tell anyone else on the floor. I will, Sarah said. The line grew quiet for a second. Allison, what is she doing? She is trying to erase him, I said, staring at the empty crib. But she left a trail. I thanked Sarah and disconnected the call. I lowered the phone to my lap and let my head rest against the wall. I had the timeline. I had the financial motive, and thanks to a vigilant nurse, I now had the documented proof of premeditation. I had the smoking gun that Attorney Sterling said I needed. But having proof and executing justice are two vastly different battles. My sister was a master of public relations. She had spent her entire adult life cultivating an image of flawless, generous grace. She hosted high-profile charity galas. She attended exclusive high society luncheons. She knew exactly how to manipulate a narrative until she emerged as either the helpless victim or the benevolent savior. If I walked into a courtroom today and waved a hospital printout, her high-priced corporate lawyers would spin it. They would claim she was just an overly eager aunt trying to prepare a gift. And I was just a bitter, unhinged woman blinded by grief. She had the money, the influence, and an audience of thousands who already believed her lies. You cannot destroy a public saint with a single piece of paper. If I wanted to tear down everything Jessica had built, I could not fight her in the light. I had to let her build her own altar of lies, stack the wood herself, and then hand her the match. 3 days after the funeral, the digital assault began. It was a Sunday morning. The sky outside my window was a flat, unforgiving gray, but inside my apartment, the air was entirely still. My phone vibrated against the granite kitchen counter, the sharp buzzing cutting through the silence. It was a text message from a woman I had not spoken to since high school, containing nothing but a screenshot and a single question mark. I tapped the image to expand it. It was a post from Jessica's Instagram account. My sister had 14,000 followers, a curated audience composed of local socialites, aspiring influencers, and wealthy housewives who treated her grid like a lifestyle magazine. The photograph was professionally shot, bathed in that warm, artificial golden hour light that makes everything look expensive. Sitting in the center of a plush cashmere throw was the golden retriever puppy. Around its neck was a thick, braided velvet ribbon. The caption read, "Meet Leo." Our family suffered a tragic loss this week, but God sent us this angel to heal our broken hearts. We are honoring our nephew the best way we know how. Please keep us in your prayers. Beneath the image, the comments were already multiplying by the hundreds. People I had never met were pouring out their sympathies. They called her an amazing aunt. They called her resilient. They praised her beautiful tribute. They offered prayers for her healing journey. I stared at the screen, watching the like count tick upward in real time. Jessica was not just showing off a pet. She was weaponizing the public narrative. In the Perez family, whoever told the story first owned the truth. By broadcasting this calculated display of grief, she was preemptively painting herself as the devastated, big-hearted matriarch. She was establishing a perimeter of public sympathy. If I ever tried to tell the truth about the trust fund, or if I complained about the sheer indignity of naming an animal after my buried child, her followers would instantly brand me as unhinged. They would say I was a bitter, jealous sister, attacking a woman who was only trying to cope. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The urge to type a response, to scream the truth into the comments section, burned in my chest. It would have been so easy to type out the timeline, to expose the hospital visit, to shatter her pristine image. But I pulled my hands back. I closed the social media application. I did not comment. I did not block her. Instead, I opened a new folder on my encrypted cloud drive. I took meticulous screenshots of the original post, capturing the exact timestamp and the location tag. I scrolled through the replies, capturing the names of her most prominent supporters. I cataloged the digital evidence with the clinical detachment of an archivist. Jessica wanted a fight. She wanted me to leave a hysterical comment so she could screenshot it, send it to our mother, and prove that I was losing my grip on reality. I gave her nothing. My silence was a wall she could not climb. When a person accustomed to getting their way does not receive the reaction they demand, they do not self-reflect. They escalate. By Tuesday morning, my refusal to engage had driven Jessica to change tactics. If she could not bait me into a public meltdown, she would force one in private by attacking the only foundation I had left. I worked as a senior billing specialist at Westport General Hospital. It was a demanding, unglamorous job, but it provided my health insurance and paid my rent. I arrived at my desk at 8, turned on my dual monitors, and began auditing a stack of rejected insurance claims. The familiar rhythm of diagnostic codes and billing modifiers usually brought me a sense of order. At 9:15, my desk phone chimed. It was the Director of Human Resources requesting my presence in her office on the 3rd floor. I walked into the administrative wing, the heavy glass door sealing shut behind me. The HR director, a woman named Pamela, sat behind a wide mahogany desk. She did not offer a warm greeting. She looked uncomfortable, her hands shuffling a printed email, her eyes darting everywhere except my face. "Please take a seat, Allison," Pamela said. Her voice adopted that soft, practiced tone corporate professionals use when they are about to deliver terrible news. I sat down, keeping my posture straight, my hands folded in my lap. "This is a very difficult conversation," Pamela began. "We are all deeply sorry for your recent loss. The hospital wants to support you during this mourning period. However, we received a highly concerning phone call this morning regarding your current state of mind." I did not blink. "Who called you?" "Pamela." She shifted in her leather chair. "The caller expressed genuine worry for your well-being. They indicated that you are suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, complicated by acute grief. They stated that your condition has deteriorated to the point where you are harassing your extended family and exhibiting erratic behavior." The strategy was breathtaking in its cruelty. Jessica had not made the call herself. She had deployed her husband, Bradley. Bradley was a prominent real estate developer and, more importantly, a Tier 1 financial donor to the hospital's pediatric wing. His name was etched into a brass plaque in the main lobby. When Bradley spoke, hospital administrators listened. "Because of the severity of these claims and the potential liability to the billing department," Pamela continued, "we feel it is best to place you on an indefinite, unpaid leave of absence. We need you to surrender your badge today. Take some time. Get the psychiatric help your family is suggesting." She slid a small plastic bin across the desk, gesturing for me to drop my identification badge into it. I looked at the bin. I looked at Pamela. I did not reach for my lanyard. I did not cry. The panic that Bradley and Jessica had banked on never materialized. Instead, I felt a sharp, crystalline focus settle over my mind. I audit complex medical claims for a living. My entire profession revolves around isolating the missing signature, finding the flaw in the documentation, and rejecting the false narrative. I understand compliance. I understand liability. "I am not surrendering my badge," I said. My voice was steady, pitched low enough to force Pamela to lean forward to hear me. "Allison, please do not make this difficult." Pamela sighed. "The caller was very clear about your instability." "Was the caller Bradley?" I asked. Pamela pressed her lips together, effectively confirming my suspicion. "He is a major benefactor, Allison. He serves on the steering committee. We have to take his warnings seriously to protect the institution." "You are not protecting the institution," I replied. "You are exposing it to catastrophic legal risk." Pamela frowned, her hands freezing over her paperwork. "Excuse me." I leaned forward. "Let us examine the facts. Pamela, You are attempting to suspend a grieving mother without pay, not based on any documented decline in my work performance, but based solely on a phone call from an external third party, a third party who possesses no medical degree, has no legal guardianship over me, and has not provided a single shred of psychiatric evidence to support a diagnosis of postpartum psychosis. Pamela opened her mouth to speak, but I did not let her. If you take my badge today, I continued, citing the regulations that governed our entire building, you are violating federal labor laws regarding workplace retaliation. You are participating in tortious interference with my employment, acting on behalf of a wealthy donor who is attempting to financially starve his sister-in-law. If you process this unpaid leave, my attorney will file an immediate injunction against this hospital. We will subpoena the donor logs. We will depose you under oath to explain why you allowed a real estate developer to dictate human resources policy by diagnosing an employee over the telephone. The color drained from Pamela's face. The soft, pitying HR facade vanished, replaced by genuine corporate terror. She looked down at the printed email on her desk, suddenly realizing it was not a shield, but a liability. I stood up from the chair. I need you to print the exact transcript of Bradley's complaint, I said. I want it on official hospital letterhead. I want it signed and dated by you, confirming that this external phone call was the sole catalyst for this meeting. Pamela swallowed hard. I cannot just hand out internal communications. You can, and you will, I said calmly, because if you do not give it to me right now, my lawyer will issue a discovery demand by 3 o'clock this afternoon, and the hospital's legal counsel will want to know why you provoked a multi-million-dollar wrongful termination lawsuit to appease a man who buys brass plaques. 5 minutes later, I walked out of the administrative wing. My employee badge was still clipped securely to my blouse. In my right hand, I held a freshly printed, signed document detailing Bradley's exact words. I had not just saved my salary, I had secured hard, undeniable proof that my sister and her husband were actively coordinating to ruin me financially. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the billing floor. The doors slid shut, hiding me from the corridor. I had won the skirmish, but the reality of the war settled heavily on my shoulders. Jessica and Bradley were willing to leverage their vast wealth and social influence to cut off my oxygen. They could make a single phone call and almost cost me my livelihood. I had a piece of paper, but they had millions of dollars and a legion of followers ready to believe their lies. How does a woman surviving on a billing clerk's salary fight back against a family that can purchase their own truth? I survived the human resources ambush, but the victory tasted like copper against my teeth. Walking out of that administrative office with a printed document was a tactical win, yet it illuminated the terrifying reality of the battlefield I was standing on. A piece of paper bearing a corporate signature was a temporary shield. It was not a sword. My sister Jessica and her husband Bradley held millions of dollars in liquid assets. They played golf with local judges. They attended private charity dinners with hospital board members and regional politicians. I could not outspend them in a courtroom. I could not outmaneuver their polished public relations machine. If I tried to fight them in the open, they would bury me under a mountain of expensive litigation and strategic whispers. To defeat an enemy equipped with infinite resources, you do not launch a frontal assault against their fortress walls. You let them open the heavy iron gates for you. For 32 years, my mother had trained me to be the submissive, apologetic shadow. I was conditioned to yield, to apologize for taking up space, and to let Jessica shine in the center of the room. I realized my lifelong conditioning was no longer a burden. It was the perfect camouflage. The night before I made my move, I sat at my small kitchen table, illuminated by the harsh blue glow of my laptop screen. I did not search for private investigators or elite defense attorneys. I navigated to a specialized electronics retailer. For $150, plus the cost of overnight priority shipping, I purchased a micro audio recording and global positioning transmitter. The device was engineered for discretion and was roughly the size of a standard watch battery, encased in a durable matte black polymer shell. It featured a hardened metal clasp designed specifically to attach seamlessly to pet collars. The internal hardware held enough battery life for 72 hours of continuous, crystal clear transmission. The package arrived in a plain brown envelope the very next morning. I needed a reason to breach the perimeter of their home without raising suspicion. I walked into my bedroom and opened the cardboard box resting on the floor of my closet. It held the few items the hospital had returned to me. I reached past the sterile plastic bags and pulled out a pale yellow baby blanket. My mother, Cynthia, had knit the blanket during her brief, highly performative phase of playing the expectant grandmother. The yarn was incredibly soft, smelling faintly of the cedar chest where she had stored it before handing it to me at a baby shower. It was a visceral, heartbreaking prop. I folded the yellow fabric neatly and placed it deep inside my tote bag, right next to the tiny black transmitter. I drove toward Jessica and Bradley's neighborhood on Thursday afternoon. The sky was bright and cold. They lived in an exclusive gated community defined by sweeping manicured lawns, imported oak trees, and ostentatious wrought iron fences. I pulled my aging Honda Civic up to the polished call box, gave my name to the private security guard, and watched the heavy metal gates swing inward. I parked in the circular driveway, stopping my car directly behind Bradley's sleek imported sports sedan. The front door of their house was towering, constructed from dark mahogany and panels of frosted glass. I stood on the pristine stone porch, smoothed the wrinkles from my plain cotton sweater, and practiced looking utterly defeated. I forced my shoulders to slump forward. I arranged my facial features into a mask of quiet resignation and sorrow. I took a slow breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, and pressed the illuminated doorbell. The door opened to reveal my sister. Jessica wore a tailored silk lounge set. She held a thin smartphone in one hand, her thumb hovering over the screen. Her expression shifted rapidly from casual boredom to a sharp, calculating triumph when she saw me standing on her welcome mat. She looked me up and down, taking in my cheap shoes and my hunched posture. She genuinely believed she had broken me. She thought the threat to my job, orchestrated by her husband, had successfully crushed my spirit and forced me to surrender. "Allison," she said, her tone dripping with a honeyed, condescending pity. "What a surprise. Are you doing okay?" I looked down at the expensive stone porch, playing the part I was assigned at birth. "I am struggling, Jessica," I said softly. "I think I let my grief cloud my judgment over the past few weeks. I came here today to apologize for being so distant and difficult." A smug, deeply satisfied smile touched the corners of her mouth. Her eyes gleamed with the thrill of unearned victory. She stepped back, gesturing grandly toward the cavernous foyer. "Come in," she offered. "I am sure you are exhausted from fighting everyone. Let us talk inside." I stepped over the threshold. The house smelled of expensive citrus candles and fresh lilies arranged in towering glass vases. The ceilings vaulted 2 stories high, causing my footsteps to echo. Beneath the sound of my shoes, I heard the faint, rhythmic clicking of paws on hardwood floors. The golden retriever puppy trotted around the corner of the hallway. It was a beautiful, healthy animal, entirely ignorant of the grotesque financial role it was being forced to play. The dog wagged its tail, approaching my knees with innocent curiosity. Jessica walked past me, heading toward the sprawling, open-concept kitchen. "Sit down in the living room," she instructed over her shoulder, not bothering to look back. "I will pour us some wine. I have a very expensive Pinot Noir open. We can clear the air." I followed her into the kitchen space, but I stopped near the edge of the massive marble island. Jessica stepped into the walk-in pantry to retrieve 2 crystal glasses. She turned her back to me for exactly 15 seconds. I did not waste a single heartbeat. I dropped silently to one knee. The puppy pressed its wet nose against my open palm. Around the animal's neck was a thick leather collar, heavily studded with artificial diamonds. I reached into the right pocket of my trousers, gripping the small black transmitter between my thumb and index finger. My eyes darted rapidly across the smooth surface of the kitchen island. Sitting next to a neat stack of incoming mail was a bright white folder bearing the embossed logo of an elite veterinary clinic. The folder was flipped open. Jessica had carelessly left the animal's intake paperwork resting in plain sight. I scanned the top sheet. Bold black ink printed across the header displayed the dog's vital statistics. My eyes locked onto the field labeled Permanent Identification. I found the 15-digit alphanumeric sequence I needed, the microchip registry number. I burned those numbers into my short-term memory, repeating the specific sequence twice in my head with ironclad focus. My hands remained remarkably steady. I slipped my fingers beneath the heavy leather collar. The puppy stood perfectly still, leaning into the scratch behind its ears. I pressed the clasp of the audio bug against the inside lining of the collar. I squeezed the metal tabs until they bit deep into the leather and locked tight. The device vanished seamlessly against the dark material, entirely hidden from view, unless someone physically removed the collar and inspected the underside with a flashlight. I stood up, dusting my knees, just as Jessica emerged from the pantry, carrying 2 long-stemmed glasses. I reached into my tote bag, pulled out the folded yellow blanket, and placed it on the edge of the marble island. "What is that?" Jessica asked. She paused, the heavy glass wine bottle hovering over the crystal rims. I kept my gaze lowered to the floorboards. "It is the blanket Mom knit for Leo," I said, letting a strategic, mournful waver enter my voice. "I thought about what you said at the cemetery, about keeping the name alive. I want your new dog to have it. I want to make peace with the family." Jessica stared at the pale yellow yarn. The triumphant gleam in her eyes brightened into sheer arrogance. She truly believed her superior status had reasserted itself, viewing the blanket as a physical trophy of my submission. She set the glasses down and placed a manicured hand over her heart. "That is very mature of you, Allison," she cooed. "I know Mom will be thrilled to hear you are finally seeing reason." "I cannot stay for wine," I whispered, stepping backward toward the foyer. "I just needed to drop that off. I need to go home and rest." "Of course," Jessica said. She walked me to the door, her voice thick with false empathy. "Take all the time you need. We are here for you." I walked out the heavy mahogany door and stepped into the crisp afternoon air. I climbed into my car, started the engine, and drove out through the wrought iron gates. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart beat with a slow, rhythmic certainty. Jessica thought she had won the war. She thought she had subdued the rebellious shadow and secured her fraudulent prize. She was entirely unaware that she had just allowed a live wiretap into the center of her home. I had the bug in place. I had the microchip number memorized. But what exactly would my mother and sister say when they thought nobody was listening? I locked the door of my apartment and did not turn on the overhead lights. The sun had already dipped below the Connecticut tree line, leaving my small living room bathed in the harsh amber glow of the street lamp outside. I walked straight to the kitchen counter, flipped open my laptop, and plugged in a pair of heavy, noise-canceling headphones. I bypassed my usual routines. I did not take off my coat. I did not pour a glass of water. My entire existence narrowed down to the digital dashboard loading on my screen. I entered the encrypted portal for the tracking device. A green indicator pulsed on the interface, confirming the signal was active and transmitting perfectly. The battery life sat at 98%. I placed the padded cups over my ears, blocking out the ambient hum of my refrigerator and the distant traffic from the street below. I pressed play. Initially, there was only a low-frequency static, followed rapidly by the muffled, rhythmic thud of canine footsteps against polished hardwood. The miniature microphone was incredibly sensitive, capturing the acoustic echo of Jessica's high-vaulted ceilings. I heard the sharp, distinct clinking of crystal glass against granite. Jessica was pouring her expensive Pinot Noir. A heavy door swung open somewhere in the background. A voice echoed through the vast foyer. It was Cynthia. Our mother had arrived at the estate. I listened to the sharp click of my mother's signature designer heels crossing the floor. Cynthia owned a boutique interior design firm located in Greenwich. On paper, it catered to elite clients seeking bespoke European aesthetics for their summer homes. In reality, the business was hemorrhaging capital. Cynthia spent more money maintaining the illusion of wealth than she actually generated in revenue. She required a constant, unending influx of cash to fund her extravagant showrooms, her exclusive country club memberships, and her carefully curated social lifestyle. I had suspected for months that she was bordering on bankruptcy, but listening to the digital feed, my suspicions transformed into undeniable facts. "You left the front door unlocked." "Jessica," my mother said, her tone carrying that familiar, breathless irritation. "Anyone could just walk right in off the street." "I just got rid of Allison," Jessica replied. The sound of wine splashing into a second glass filled the audio channel. "She actually showed up here playing the wounded deer. She brought that cheap yellow blanket you knit and practically begged for forgiveness." I heard my mother exhale a long, theatrical sigh. Thank God she is finally seeing reason. Her behavior at the hospital and the cemetery was becoming an embarrassment. We have a reputation to maintain in this community. The jingling of metal tags interrupted their exchange. The dog was shifting its weight, scratching its neck right beside the hidden transmitter. Every scrape of the heavy leather collar resonated loudly in my ears, bringing a strange sense of vertigo. I was sitting in my dark, silent apartment, but my auditory reality was anchored inside my sister's kitchen. "Did you hear from the trust administrator yet?" Cynthia asked. The pitch of her voice dropped, adopting a conspiratorial edge that made my stomach turn. "His paralegal called this morning," Jessica answered. "The initial screening cleared." Utilizing the hospital paperwork bypassed the automated flagging system, just like Bradley's lawyer predicted. The executor officially opened the file under the name Leo Perez. The funds enter the preliminary holding state on Monday morning. $450,000, my mother breathed. I could practically hear the tension leaving her rigid shoulders. "We can finally stabilize the design firm. The vendors have been threatening to file commercial liens against me all week. This saves everything." They were not merely taking advantage of a tragedy. They had engineered a financial rescue operation on the fresh grave of my infant. They viewed my son's brief existence as nothing more than a convenient key to unlock a corporate vault. "We just have to keep up the morning routine for a few more weeks," Jessica said. The sound of a stainless steel refrigerator door opening echoed through the feed. Once the capital transfers into the primary account, we pivot. We submit the maintenance trust addendum, list the animal as the namesake beneficiary. And Bradley's accountant buries the disbursement in an offshore holding company so the tax footprint disappears. I sat perfectly still in the dark. My breathing grew shallow, forcing myself to inhale through my nose to remain calm. "You really think Allison will stay quiet?" Cynthia asked, a trace of nervous doubt creeping into her words. "She does not have a choice," my sister scoffed. "Bradley already boxed her in at the hospital. She is terrified of losing her paycheck. Besides, what is she going to do? Sue us? With what money?" "She is weak, Mom. She has always been weak. She will crawl back to her little cubicle and leave us alone." The dog barked, a sharp, happy sound that piqued the audio meter on my screen. "Here you go, Leo," Jessica cooed, her voice shifting into a sickening high-pitched baby tone. "Who wants filet mignon? You do. Yes, you do." The sound of the animal chewing filled the headphones. The metal collar clinked rhythmically against a porcelain bowl. "He really is a gorgeous dog," my mother noted, her heels clicking as she walked closer to the animal. Much better suited for the country club holiday photos anyway. "Exactly," Jessica replied. I heard the distinct rustle of silk fabric. She was kneeling down on the floor, petting the thick fur around the dog's neck. Her fingers grazed the exact spot where the black plastic bug was attached. "That dog is more of a Perez than her bastard baby ever was." The phrase hung in the air. It echoed through the digital stream, searing itself into the deepest parts of my brain. The sheer, unvarnished cruelty of it paralyzed my vocal cords. I did not move. I did not weep. The tears that should have fallen felt like they had turned to ice behind my eyes. My own mother, the woman who carried me for 9 months, let out a soft, approving laugh in response to that statement. She laughed. The dramatic irony was thick enough to choke on. Jessica was casually outlining federal wire fraud, identity theft, and the systematic financial exploitation of a deceased child. She was gloating about her untouchable status, all while blindly stroking the exact device that was currently transmitting her confession directly to my laptop. I reached for the trackpad. My fingers moved with mechanical precision. I halted the live feed and exported the stored audio cache. I converted the raw data into 3 distinct encrypted files. I uploaded the first copy to a secure offshore cloud server. I transferred the second copy to an external hard drive hidden beneath the floorboards of my bedroom closet. I emailed the third copy to a newly created, anonymous email address. The evidence was secure. I possessed the entire blueprint of their criminal enterprise, spoken in their own voices. But staring at the loading bar on my screen, a cold reality settled over my strategic plan. I could not simply hand this digital file to a judge or the trust administrator. Connecticut is a strict 2-party consent state regarding audio recordings. An illicit wiretap planted on a domestic pet inside a private residence would be thrown out of probate court before the clerk even stamped the docket. If I presented this file directly, Jessica's corporate litigators would immediately file criminal eavesdropping and trespassing charges against me. They would shift the legal crosshairs from her financial fraud to my illegal surveillance. The recording was a nuclear warhead, but I had no legal launch code. I possessed the audio, but an illegal wiretap is not admissible in probate court. How do you turn a stolen confession into a legal weapon? 2 days after I secured the transmitter to the dog collar, a heavy knock echoed through my apartment. I opened my front door to find a man in a rumpled windbreaker. He did not ask how my day was going. He confirmed my name, thrust a thick manila envelope into my hands, and walked away. I stood in my entryway, broke the seal, and pulled out a stack of legal documents stamped by the Hartford Family Court. It was an emergency petition for a temporary financial conservatorship. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, deciphering the tactical maneuver my sister had just deployed. The wiretap audio had revealed that the trust administrator was beginning to ask routine administrative questions regarding the birth certificate. Jessica and her corporate litigators had recognized a potential vulnerability. If the executor required a secondary verification, or if I decided to formally contest the namesake payout, their entire fraudulent enterprise would collapse. They needed to neutralize my legal standing. If a judge granted Jessica conservatorship over my finances and my legal autonomy, she would effectively become my guardian. She could sign documents on my behalf. She could formally withdraw any objections to the trust disbursement. She could silence me legally, medically, and financially. To secure this ruling, her lawyers had drafted a petition painting me as a clear and present danger to myself. They cited severe grief-induced psychosis. They claimed I was fixated on a domestic pet, harassing my family members, and incapable of managing my basic affairs. Attached to the petition was a court order demanding my immediate compliance with a 3-hour psychological evaluation to be conducted by a state-appointed psychiatrist. The strategy was chilling in its efficiency. In modern American society, using the court system to strip away a person's autonomy is a terrifyingly effective weapon. It forces the victim onto the defensive, requiring them to prove their own sanity to a stranger with a clipboard. I did not hire a defense attorney to block the evaluation. Fighting the court order would only validate their narrative that I was uncooperative and erratic. I accepted the appointment. I spent the next 48 hours gathering my materials with the cold, meticulous focus of an auditor preparing for a hostile review. The evaluation took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in a sterile gray building located in downtown Hartford. I walked into the examination room wearing a tailored navy blazer, a crisp white blouse, and dark trousers. My hair was pulled back into a severe, neat knot. I carried a single black leather portfolio. The court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Allison Perez, sat behind a generic laminate desk. He was a man in his late 50s with tired eyes and a graying beard. He glanced up from my file as I entered. I could read the subtle shift in his posture. He had reviewed the petition filed by my sister. He was expecting a shattered, weeping woman. He was bracing himself for a hysterical mother who needed to be handled with extreme delicacy. I sat down in the plastic chair opposite him, keeping my spine perfectly straight. I crossed my ankles, folded my hands in my lap, and offered a polite, measured greeting. Dr. Thorne opened his notepad. "Allison," he began, his voice dropping into that familiar clinical cadence, "I want to start by acknowledging your recent loss. I know this is an incredibly difficult time." "Thank you, doctor," I replied, my voice steady and resonant. He clicked his pen. "Your sister, Jessica, initiated this petition. She and her husband have expressed profound concern regarding your mental state. They detail instances of you acting irrationally, showing up unannounced, and exhibiting a concerning fixation on their new dog. Can you tell me your perspective on these claims?" I did not raise my voice. I did not sound defensive. I unzipped my black leather portfolio and retrieved the printed document I had secured from my hospital human resources department. "My sister is currently attempting to secure a $450,000 payout from our late grandfather's estate," I said, sliding the paper across the desk. "The terms of the trust require the funds to be dispersed to a namesake heir. My son, Leo, was the rightful beneficiary. Jessica recently purchased a golden retriever, named it Leo, and is currently petitioning the trust executor to redirect my deceased child's inheritance into a maintenance account under her control." Dr. Thorne stopped writing. He looked at the HR document resting near his hand. "I am not experiencing a fixation on a dog," I continued calmly. "I am observing an active financial fraud. When I refused to endorse her actions, her husband contacted the administration at the hospital where I am employed. Please read the document you are holding, doctor. It is a signed confirmation from the Director of Human Resources. Bradley attempted to leverage his status as a financial donor to suspend me without pay, citing the exact same psychiatric claims listed in your file." Dr. Thorne picked up the paper. His eyes tracked across the official hospital letterhead. "They are using my grief as a weapon," I stated. "They are attempting to strip me of my financial autonomy so they can control my legal standing in probate court. It is not an emotional dispute. It is a calculated theft." The psychiatrist set the paper down. He looked at me with renewed intensity. "That is a very serious allegation, Allison. But the petition also references erratic behavior. It claims you have been hostile and threatening at their residence." I reached into my portfolio a second time. I pulled out a small tablet. A week prior to the petition, frustrated that I was ignoring her text messages, Jessica had marched up to my apartment door. I did not open it. I simply let the security camera record. I tapped the screen and slid the tablet across the desk. "Please watch this," I instructed. The heavily edited, legally permissible, snippet of my Ring doorbell camera began to play. The video showed Jessica standing in my narrow hallway. Her face was twisted in rage. She pounded her fist against my door. "You better answer my calls, Allison," her voice shrieked from the tablet speaker. "You are going to sign the trust waiver, or Bradley will make sure you never work in this county again. Do you hear me? You are nothing." The video ended, leaving a dense silence in the examination room. I folded my hands back in my lap. I evaluate fraudulent medical billing claims for a living. Doctor. My job requires me to separate emotional narratives from empirical evidence. The woman in that video is not attempting to help a grieving sister. She is attempting to extort a vulnerable target. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Thorne did not ask me about my capacity to balance a checkbook or my ability to manage my own affairs. We discussed the psychological profile of the Perez family. I dissected my sister's sociopathic tendencies, her obsession with status, and her history of using our mother to manipulate outcomes. I painted a precise, unvarnished portrait of a woman who viewed a tragic funeral as a lucrative business opportunity. I answered every clinical question with the cold, unyielding logic of a professional auditor. By the time the evaluation concluded, Dr. Thorne closed his notepad. He handed the tablet and the HR document back to me. His expression was no longer clinical. It was grim. "I will be submitting my evaluation to the family court judge this afternoon," he said. 3 days later, I received a certified copy of the final psychiatric report in the mail. Dr. Thorne had dismissed the petition in its entirety. He declared me fully competent, lucid, and capable of managing all personal and financial affairs. But the most crucial element of his evaluation was located at the very bottom of the page. In a stark, formal footnote, Dr. Thorne questioned the malicious intent of the petitioners. He strongly recommended that the family court review the possibility that the conservatorship request was a coordinated effort to enact financial abuse against a grieving mother. The petition was immediately thrown out. Jessica's legal weapon had backfired, striking her own credibility. She had tried to lock me in a psychiatric cage, but she only succeeded in providing me with a state-certified document proving my sanity and highlighting her corruption. I stood in my kitchen, reading the footnote one more time before sliding the report into a secure folder. The psychological warfare had failed, but the victory was purely defensive. The trust administrator was still processing the paperwork. The $450,000 disbursement was still pending, moving closer to Jessica's offshore accounts with every passing hour. I had my shield, but I needed a sword. I needed her to cross a line from which she could never return. Jessica had survived the scrutiny of a psychiatrist, but how would she react if I handed her exactly what she wanted? How do you bait a trap for a woman who believes she is invincible? To bait a trap for a predator who believes they are untouchable, you do not use an artificial lure. You use raw meat. You use the exact resource they are hunting. I sat at my kitchen table on a quiet Thursday evening, my laptop glowing in the dim light. The victory at the family court had provided me with a temporary shield, but the clock was still ticking against me. The trust administrator was currently reviewing the paperwork my sister submitted. Any day now, the executor could approve the namesake maintenance account, allowing Jessica to legally funnel my deceased son's inheritance into her offshore holdings. I had to intercept her before the financial firm released the capital. I had to force her to commit the fraud in her own handwriting. On my terms. I pulled up a blank digital notepad and typed out the 15-digit alphanumeric sequence I had memorized from the veterinary paperwork in Jessica's kitchen. I opened my web browser and navigated to the official registry portal for the American Kennel Club. To an outside observer, I was simply registering a domestic pet. In reality, I was arming a timed explosive. I filled out the online forms with clinical precision. I selected the breed, noted the golden coat color, and inputted the unique microchip identification number. When the interface prompted me for the official registered name of the animal, my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I did not type the name of my child. I typed 2 distinct words: Jessica's debt. I navigated to the payment screen, entered my personal credit card information, and paid the $35 processing fee. A digital certificate generated on my screen confirming the registration was permanent and legally bound to that microchip. That was step 1. The future climax was securely anchored in a federal database. Step 2 required capital. If I wanted to force my sister into signing a legally binding confession, I could not present her with an empty threat or a forged document. The bait had to be real. Jessica desired $450,000 to save our mother's failing interior design firm. I needed to hand that exact sum to her, wrapped in a bow of apparent defeat. I was a medical billing clerk. I did not possess a fraction of that liquid cash in my savings account. But I possessed something else. During my third trimester of pregnancy, anticipating the harsh realities of single motherhood after my former partner vanished, I had purchased a comprehensive whole life insurance policy. It was a robust financial instrument that carried a substantial cash value component, designed to guarantee my son would be provided for if anything catastrophic happened to me. It allowed for short-term borrowing against the death benefit. On Friday morning, I drove to my local bank branch. I sat in a glass-enclosed office across from a senior loan officer. I initiated a high-interest, immediate collateral loan against my entire policy. I liquidated the safety net I had painstakingly woven for my child. I leveraged my future, my credit, and my financial security. The banker printed a certified cashier's check made payable to my sister for the sum of $450,000. The slip of paper felt heavy in my hands. It carried the weight of my total ruin if my strategy failed. Step 3 was timing. In the corporate legal ecosystem, there is a specific, well-known window of vulnerability. It occurs on Friday afternoon, precisely at 4:30. At this hour, high-priced litigators are unreachable. They have left their downtown offices. They are commuting to their weekend homes. They are sitting in private clubhouses with their phones switched to silent. If a client receives a complex legal document at 4:30 on a Friday, they cannot reach their legal counsel for a formal review until Monday morning. For a patient, rational person, a weekend delay is a minor inconvenience. For an arrogant, cash-starved narcissist staring at a fortune, a weekend is an eternity. Jessica and Cynthia needed liquidity immediately. Vendors were threatening to file commercial liens against the design firm. The pressure to secure the funds was mounting daily. I was counting on their profound greed to override their basic legal caution. I returned to my apartment and drafted the final piece of the puzzle. I utilized a template Attorney Sterling had outlined for me. To the untrained eye, the document appeared to be a standard acknowledgement of receipt. It looked like a simple administrative form confirming the transfer of settlement funds to avoid future probate litigation. In reality, the legal phrasing was weaponized. It was a formal confession of fraudulent appropriation. The text explicitly acknowledged the receipt of the specific trust funds designated for the namesake heir. It confirmed that the signatory accepted the money, knowing the human beneficiary had perished. And it contained a clause verifying the intent to redirect those funds. I placed the cashier's check and the confession document into a heavy cardboard mailer. I took a standard yellow sticky note and wrote a brief, defeated message in blue ink. I wrote, "I am done fighting. Take it. Just sign the enclosed receipt so my lawyer closes the file." I pressed the sticky note directly over the dense legal jargon near the signature line. It was a brilliant psychological diversion. The casual, handwritten note projected surrender. It lowered the emotional defenses of the reader, drawing their eye away from the fine print and focusing their attention solely on the attached cashier's check. I hired an independent private courier service. I handed the driver the sealed cardboard mailer and provided explicit instructions. He was to arrive at the gated community and ring the doorbell at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. He was to hand the envelope directly to the resident. I drove my Honda Civic to a quiet suburban street 3 blocks away from my sister's estate. I parked the car beneath the shade of a large oak tree. I turned off the engine. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, and stared at the digital clock on my dashboard. The numbers shifted with agonizing slowness. 4:20, 4:25, 4:28. My breathing grew shallow. Everything I had worked for, every dollar I possessed, was currently riding in the passenger seat of a courier van. If Jessica paused, if she decided to wait until Monday to call her husband's corporate lawyer, my plan would disintegrate. Her legal team would spot the confession instantly. They would shred the document, keep the check, and leave me destitute. 4:30. My cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an automated text message from the delivery service. The package had been signed for at the front door. The envelope was officially inside the house. I placed the phone on the passenger seat. I reached into my bag and pulled out my noise-canceling headphones. I plugged them into my laptop and connected to the encrypted cloud server, streaming the audio from the dog collar. Jessica was now holding a certified check for nearly $500,000. She was staring at a piece of paper that could solve all of her mother's financial crises in a single stroke of a pen. The bait was set. The trap was armed. Will her arrogance override her caution? And what exactly will she say when she realizes she holds the key to her own destruction? I had navigated my car away from the suburban street and returned to my apartment the moment the courier application confirmed the package was out for delivery. I needed the absolute, unbroken silence of my own kitchen to monitor the feed, free from the unpredictable noises of neighborhood traffic. I sat at my small dining table, the noise-canceling headphones pressed tight against my ears, staring at the audio equalizer dancing across my laptop monitor. The world outside my window dissolved into insignificance. My entire reality shrank down to the digital audio streaming through the encrypted server. The wiretap fastened to the dog collar captured the ambient acoustics of my sister's sprawling estate with terrifying clarity. I heard the rhythmic tapping of the retriever's claws against the imported Brazilian hardwood. I heard the low, mechanical hum of the central air conditioning system kicking on, pushing climate-controlled air through the cavernous living room. The dog panted softly, shifting its weight, entirely unaware of the surveillance device clinging to its neck. Then, the heavy brass knocker on the front door clattered twice. It was a sharp, resonant sound that spiked the green bars on my audio interface into the red zone. The dog barked loudly, a sequence of sharp yelps echoing through the foyer. Footsteps approached at a rapid pace. Jessica's voice, clipped and annoyed, ordered the animal to sit. I heard the heavy oak door unlatch and swing open, the hinges gliding on well-oiled tracks. "Delivery for Jessica," a muffled, professional voice announced. "I will take it," my sister replied. Her tone held that specific brand of impatient dismissal she reserved for service workers. A brief exchange of movement followed, a digital clipboard being tapped, the heavy front door sealing shut, locking out the cold Connecticut air. For 4 seconds, the audio feed consisted only of the dog sniffing the visitor's lingering scent near the threshold. Then came the distinct, rough sound of thick cardboard tearing. Jessica was ripping open the security mailer. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the microphone. The rustling of paper followed, the crisp snap of a certified cashier's check being unfolded. Jessica let out a sound I had never heard her make in public. It was a shrieking laugh, devoid of any curated elegance. It was a raw, predatory noise, the sound of a scavenger discovering an unguarded feast. She began pacing across the hardwood floor, her designer slippers slapping against the floorboards in a rapid, euphoric rhythm. The dog trotted closely beside her, keeping the microphone perfectly positioned to capture every syllable. She tapped the screen of her smartphone. The dial tone rang twice before the line connected. Jessica engaged the speakerphone function, allowing the wiretap to record both sides of the exchange with pristine fidelity. "Mom, pick up the phone," Jessica demanded, not waiting for a greeting. Cynthia answered, her voice tight with the underlying anxiety of her failing business. "What is it? Did the trust administrator call back? Did the vendors issue the lien?" She caved. Jessica screamed, the sheer volume of her triumph distorting the audio feed for a fraction of a second. Mom, the little bitch actually caved. I closed my eyes, letting the insult wash over me without flinching. My breathing remained slow and measured. "What are you talking about?" Cynthia asked, the confusion evident in her hesitant tone. "Allison," Jessica declared, her pacing accelerating. "She just sent a courier to my front door. I am holding a cashier's check for $450,000. She liquidated some sort of insurance policy. There is a sticky note attached to the paperwork. She says she is done fighting and wants to settle this so her lawyer can close the file." A long, heavy silence stretched across the phone line. Cynthia possessed the same moral bankruptcy as my sister, but she was older, and age had taught her a baseline level of caution. A check for that amount of money, arriving unprompted on a Friday afternoon, triggered her self-preservation instincts. "Jessica, you need to be careful," Cynthia warned. "Read the documents attached to the check. Do not sign anything yet. You need to call Bradley's attorney and have him review the settlement terms." Jessica halted her pacing. She let out a scoff of profound, arrogant irritation. The sound perfectly encapsulated her lifelong relationship with risk and consequence. Growing up, Jessica never read the required materials for her high school examinations. She relied on summaries and the labor of her classmates. She never evaluated the structural risks of her real estate investments. She only focused on the projected commissions. She viewed due diligence as a tedious obstacle meant for lesser, unexceptional people. "Mom, look at the time," Jessica argued, her voice dripping with condescension. "It is 5 o'clock on a Friday evening. Bradley's corporate lawyer is already driving up to his cabin in the Berkshires. I am not paying him $600 an hour to read a single-page surrender receipt." "But it could be a trap," Cynthia reasoned, her anxiety bleeding through the speaker. "What if she's trying to trick you?" "Trick me into what?" Jessica shot back, her hubris blinding her to the very real snare closing around her ankles. "The check is certified. I am looking at the watermarks right now. The receipt is just a standard release form acknowledging the transfer of funds. It explicitly says it closes the dispute over the Leo namesake payout. She knows she cannot afford a protracted legal battle in probate court. She is terrified of Bradley ruining her career at the hospital. She took out a loan to buy her way out of the crosshairs. She knows she lost." I sat at my kitchen table, tracing the wood grain with my index finger. The psychological profile I had built of my own sister was proving flawless. The check was an intoxicating validation of her entire worldview. She believed she was inherently destined to win every conflict she entered. The money proved her superiority. In her mind, the attached paperwork was nothing more than an administrative nuisance, a final surrender flag from a defeated sibling. "Read the receipt to me," Cynthia instructed, attempting a last maneuver of parental authority. Jessica sighed loudly, an exaggerated display of suffering. "It says, 'Acknowledgement of receipt of funds. The undersigned accepts the enclosed sum in relation to the Leo Namesake Trust disbursement. By signing, the recipient confirms the transfer satisfies all claims and intent regarding the deceased beneficiary.' It is legal jargon, Mom. She is just covering her bases so we cannot sue her later for harassment." She was skimming the text. Her eyes were skipping over the critical, devastating subclauses. She saw the words receipt of funds and ignored the precise legal mechanisms surrounding them. She missed the paragraph explicitly acknowledging that the enclosed funds were intended for a human beneficiary who had perished. She skipped over the sentence confirming her fraudulent intent to redirect those specific funds into her own accounts. Attorney Sterling had drafted a masterpiece of lethal corporate camouflage. "I am signing it," Jessica declared, terminating the debate. "I will deposit the check into my private account first thing tomorrow morning, and I will wire you the capital to pay off the interior design vendors by Monday afternoon. We are safe, Mom. We won." She ended the call. The dial tone severed the connection. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, my heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I heard the distinct sliding of a desk drawer opening. I heard the shuffle of the thick document being pressed flat against a hard surface. Then came the sound I had wagered my entire financial future to capture. It was the heavy, metallic scratch of a fountain pen nib dragging across high-quality paper. The The sound lasted for 3 seconds. A sweeping, cursive signature locking her fate into the permanent legal record. Jessica did not realize the receipt she had just endorsed was a binding confession of fraudulent appropriation. She had just provided me with a documented, signed admission of her scheme to defraud our grandfather's estate and exploit my son's identity. I pressed the stop button on the recording software. I exported the final audio file, securing it in the encrypted offshore vault alongside the previous conversations. I pulled the headphones down, letting them rest around my neck. The silence of my kitchen returned, thick and absolute. I possessed the signed confession. The moment the courier returned that document to Sterling's office, the legal battle would shift irreversibly in my favor. If presented to a judge, that single piece of paper would detonate her defense strategy. Yet, as I stared at the dark screen of my laptop, a hollow sensation settled in my chest. A legal victory was quiet. A probate court ruling would be buried in municipal archives, sealed away under layers of corporate non-disclosure agreements and private settlements. Socialites like Jessica and Bradley survived legal defeats by paying fines and spinning the narrative at country club luncheons. They would paint themselves as victims of a complex contractual misunderstanding. They would retreat to their gated community, their reputations bruised, but structurally intact. A piece of paper was sufficient to secure the money, but a piece of paper was not enough to destroy a woman who built her entire existence on the perception of others. To truly dismantle her life, to exact a justice that matched the cruelty of naming an animal after a buried infant, the destruction could not occur in the shadows of a courtroom. It had to be a public execution. The monster hiding behind the mourning veil had to be dragged into the brightest, most unforgiving light possible. Late May brought a suffocating humidity to the Connecticut coastline, but inside the downtown Hartford financial district, the climate was regulated to a crisp 68 degrees. The mandatory mediation took place in a mahogany-paneled boardroom on the 50th floor of the Trust Administrator building. The room was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of the city, while the interior was dominated by a long, polished wooden table that reflected the cold fluorescent lighting above. I arrived early with attorney David Sterling. I wore a simple black suit and kept my hair pulled back into a severe knot. I took my seat on the western side of the table and folded my hands in my lap. I did not speak. I simply watched the room assemble itself. The trust administrator, a rigid man named Caldwell, sat at the head of the table. He wore a gray suit and an expression of permanent administrative fatigue. To his right sat a licensed court stenographer. Her specialized keyboard rested on a metal tripod. Her fingers hovered over the keys, ready to capture every syllable spoken during the proceeding. In probate mediation, the official transcript is an unalterable truth. Once a word is logged by the stenographer, it cannot be erased, retracted, or denied. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy oak doors swung open. Jessica walked into the boardroom. My sister had abandoned her usual vibrant designer wardrobe for this occasion. She wore a modest, dark navy shift dress that fell below the knee. She had removed her ostentatious diamond tennis bracelets, opting instead for a single strand of understated pearls. Her makeup was applied with strategic restraint, designed to make her look pale, exhausted, and burdened by a profound family tragedy. It was a masterclass in weaponized modesty. She was playing the role of the grieving, noble aunt who only sought to protect her family's legacy from a bitter, unstable sibling. Beside her walked her corporate litigator, a man named Harrison. He possessed the polished, overly confident aura of an attorney accustomed to bullying his way through civil disputes on behalf of wealthy real estate developers. He set his thick leather briefcase on the table and offered a brief, tight-lipped nod to Sterling. Caldwell initiated the mediation. He outlined the parameters of the meeting, noting the dispute over the $450,000 disbursement allocated by my late grandfather's estate. He then turned the floor over to Jessica's legal counsel. Harrison stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He projected a calm, authoritative voice that echoed slightly off the acoustic ceiling tiles. He began by painting a tragic portrait of the Perez family. He spoke of my son's untimely passing with a rehearsed solemnity. He described the profound void left in the family structure. Then he pivoted to his central argument. He gestured toward Jessica, who lowered her eyes toward her lap in a display of manufactured sorrow. "My client sought a way to heal this family," Harrison proclaimed. She recognized that the late patriarch of this estate held a deep, unyielding desire for his name to live on. The namesake clause in Section 4 of the trust is not merely a financial directive, it is a spiritual mandate. When the infant passed, my client took it upon herself to honor that mandate. She acquired a companion animal, a golden retriever, and legally registered it under the name Leo Perez. We are asking this office to recognize the establishment of a namesake maintenance account. Probate law provides flexibility when honoring the spirit of a deceased patriarch, and this animal fulfills the fundamental intent of the original trust. Harrison sat down, looking immensely satisfied with his own rhetoric. He had reframed a grotesque financial theft into an act of profound familial devotion. Jessica kept her gaze focused on the table, her hands trembling just enough to appear genuine to an untrained observer. I sat perfectly still. I did not glare at my sister. I did not shake my head. I watched the stenographer. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, translating Harrison's eloquent spin into a permanent digital record. Sterling opened his thin leather portfolio. He did not stand up. He leaned forward, resting his forearms against the cool mahogany surface. "Mr. Harrison," Sterling began, his voice pitched low, carrying a surgical precision. "Your argument relies on the executor demonstrating flexibility regarding the beneficiary. However, before we discuss the philosophical intent of the grandfather, I want to clarify the structural timeline of your filing." Harrison raised his chin, signaling his readiness to spar. "Please do," he replied. "The initial compliance protocols for this specific trust require the presentation of vital records to open the disbursement file," Sterling noted, referencing a page in his folder. "The automated system flags any application lacking official documentation. How did you initiate the preliminary claim before formally petitioning for the animal maintenance account?" Harrison smiled. It was the smile of a man eager to showcase his own legal ingenuity. He believed Sterling was asking a procedural question because we were looking for an administrative technicality to stall the payout. "It was a standard administrative bridge," Harrison explained smoothly. "To satisfy the preliminary automated compliance check, we utilized the hospital birth certificate of the deceased infant. This allowed the system to generate the initial file under the required namesake. Once the file cleared the automated screening, we prepared the secondary addendum to substitute the animal as the ongoing beneficiary of the maintenance account. It was a necessary placeholder to keep the timeline intact." I felt my heartbeat slow down. The rhythm in my chest became a steady, deliberate drum. Sterling turned his head toward the end of the table. "Madam Stenographer," he said, keeping his tone entirely conversational, "could you please read back Mr. Harrison's last statement for the official record?" The room fell silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning vents. The stenographer adjusted her glasses, scrolled up on her small digital monitor, and read the text aloud in a flat, monotone voice. "To satisfy the preliminary automated compliance check, we utilized the hospital birth certificate of the deceased infant. This allowed the system to generate the initial file under the required namesake." Sterling nodded his thanks. He turned back to face the opposing counsel. "Mr. Harrison," Sterling said, "you have just stated on the official record of a probate mediation that you and your client knowingly submitted the vital records of a deceased human infant to a financial institution. You admitted to utilizing those records to bypass an automated security screening in order to trigger a $450,000 capital disbursement, with the premeditated intent to redirect those funds to a domestic pet." Harrison frowned, his confident posture slipping a fraction of an inch. "We utilized the document to satisfy a flawed automated portal. The intent was always to establish the maintenance trust." Submitting a document under false pretenses to trigger the release of institutional capital across state lines is not an administrative bridge, Sterling corrected. It is the textbook definition of federal wire fraud. Jessica shifted in her chair, her performance faltering. She looked at her lawyer, expecting him to shut Sterling down. She did not understand the intricate legal trap that had just snapped shut around them. Harrison placed his hands flat on the table. "You are grasping at straws, David. My client has acted with complete transparency regarding the trust. She has signed nothing indicating fraudulent intent." Sterling reached into his portfolio. He withdrew a single sheet of paper. It was the document delivered by the courier on Friday afternoon. The document Jessica had signed in her kitchen while drinking expensive wine and laughing about my dead child. "Actually," Sterling said softly, sliding the paper across the long expanse of the mahogany table, "your client has signed something rather specific." The paper came to a halt directly in front of Harrison. The corporate litigator looked down at the page. I watched his eyes track the text. He recognized the standard formatting of a surrender receipt. He read the top line. Then his gaze reached the second paragraph. I observed the exact moment his brain processed the legal phrasing. He read the explicit acknowledgement that the funds were accepted with full knowledge that the human beneficiary had perished. He read the clause confirming the intent to redirect those specific funds. Finally, his eyes dropped to the bottom of the page. He stared at the sweeping, cursive signature in blue ink, his client's signature. A profound, suffocating tension seized the boardroom. The color drained entirely from Harrison's face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He was a wealthy corporate lawyer, but he was not a fool. He instantly recognized the document resting in front of him. It was a legally binding confession of fraudulent appropriation, and he had just spent the last 10 minutes detailing the exact mechanics of that fraud on the official stenographer's transcript. Harrison did not speak. He did not attempt to formulate a defense. He acted on pure, unfiltered self-preservation. He let go of the paper as if it were burning his fingers. He gripped the armrests of his leather chair and physically pushed himself backward. The wheels squeaked sharply against the floorboards as he created 2 feet of distance between himself and the mahogany table. He was putting physical space between himself and his client to avoid being implicated as a co-conspirator in a federal crime. Jessica stared at her lawyer, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Harrison, what is it?" she whispered. "What does it say?" She reached for the paper. The lawyer realized he was trapped in a room with a client who had secretly destroyed her own case without consulting him. But Sterling was not finished. He left the signed confession resting on the table and reached into his portfolio one last time. He pulled out a thick, bound document with yellowing edges, the original 1998 estate charter. "You have confessed to fraud on the record," Sterling stated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "But the criminal liability is only the beginning of your problem, Jessica." The litigator looked at the thick charter, then back to Sterling, true panic setting into his eyes. There was a second, far more devastating clause buried in the pages of that trust, a clause Jessica had never bothered to read. What was waiting for her in the fine print? The friction of the chair wheels scraping against the hardwood floor resonated like a gunshot in the silent boardroom. Harrison pressed his back against the far wall, distancing himself from the mahogany table as if the paper resting upon it carried a lethal contagion. He was a veteran litigator who specialized in shielding wealthy clients from civil liabilities. But he recognized the insurmountable divide between a contract dispute and a documented felony. Jessica reached her hand out, her manicured fingernails hovering over the signed confession. She looked at her attorney, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Harrison," she whispered, her voice stripped of its prior arrogance. "What does it say? Tell me, what is happening?" Harrison did not look at her. He directed his gaze toward the head of the table, making direct eye contact with Caldwell, the trust administrator. "Mr. Caldwell," Harrison stated, his tone devoid of any protective warmth, Let the official record reflect that my firm was entirely unaware of this extraneous documentation. Effective immediately, I am withdrawing as legal counsel for the petitioner due to a fundamental conflict of interest." He stepped forward, grabbed the handle of his leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. He did not offer Jessica a parting glance. He turned on his heel and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving his client isolated in the center of the hostile room. Our mother, Cynthia, sat in the chair directly to Jessica's right. Until this moment, Cynthia had remained perfectly still, serving as silent, elegant moral support for her favored daughter. Now, a profound tremor overtook her hands. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning bone white. She did not understand the intricate legal mechanisms of probate law, but she possessed a primal understanding of disaster. She recognized the scent of ruin when a $600 an hour attorney fled a mediation room. Jessica stared at the closed doors, her mouth slightly open. She turned her attention back to Attorney Sterling, her eyes narrowing. "Fine," she snapped, attempting to project a bravado she no longer possessed. "You tricked me into signing a receipt. You can keep the $450,000. I will withdraw the maintenance petition today. We do not need the namesake money." She believed she was offering a tactical retreat. She thought she was surrendering a pawn to protect her queen. She did not comprehend the architecture of the trap she had walked into. Sterling did not celebrate. His expression remained unnervingly clinical. He reached into his thin leather portfolio and withdrew a heavy, bound document featuring yellowing, textured pages. It was the original estate charter, drafted by our grandfather in 1998. My grandfather was a man who constructed a regional logistics empire from a single delivery truck. He navigated a ruthless corporate landscape defined by embezzlement, cutthroat negotiations, and relentless betrayal. He trusted no one, least of all his own descendants. When he commissioned his estate planning, he did not merely allocate his wealth. He built a legal fortress equipped with hidden tripwires, designed specifically to punish any heir who attempted to subvert his final wishes. You cannot simply withdraw a fraudulent petition after the fraud has been executed and confessed to on the record, Sterling explained, his voice smooth and steady. But the criminal liability waiting for you at the federal level is a separate matter. We are here today to resolve the probate standing. Sterling flipped open the heavy charter. The thick paper rustled in the quiet room. He bypassed the standard distribution schedules, turning past the real estate deeds and the liquid asset allocations. He stopped on page 42. He pressed his index finger against the text under Section 8. I want you to listen very carefully to the foundational rules of your grandfather's estate, Sterling instructed. He looked down at the page and began to read aloud. Any beneficiary who attempts to defraud the trust or attempts to steal the inheritance of another designated heir shall be immediately and irrevocably stripped of their entire share of the estate. The temperature in the boardroom plummeted. The hum of the air conditioning vents seemed to amplify, filling the silence that followed those words. Sterling looked up from the document, his eyes locking onto my sister. You did not just risk the initial baby bonus, Jessica, by submitting a false claim utilizing the vital records of your deceased nephew. And by signing a confession acknowledging your intent to redirect those specific funds into your own accounts, you triggered the poison pill embedded in the charter. Jessica stared at him, her jaw hanging slack. She blinked rapidly, her brain struggling to process the catastrophic mathematics of her situation. Under the strict terms of Section 8, Sterling continued, delivering the final blow with surgical precision, you have legally forfeited your right to the main estate. Your designated payout of $2.1 million is hereby revoked. The capital will revert back to the primary holding account to be distributed among the remaining heirs in good standing. A sharp, ragged gasp shattered the quiet of the room. It did not come from my sister. It came from my mother. Cynthia pressed her hands against her chest, her fingers clawing at the expensive silk of her blouse. The air trapped itself in her throat. She began to hyperventilate, taking short, panicked breaths that echoed off the mahogany walls. The illusion she had maintained for her entire adult life was evaporating in front of her eyes. Cynthia had banked her entire future on that $2.1 million inheritance. She had leveraged her boutique interior design firm to the breaking point, taking out predatory commercial loans and stringing along angry vendors with the promise of an imminent, massive cash infusion. She had structured her entire reality around the guarantee of Jessica's wealth. The bailout money she desperately needed to stave off bankruptcy was not merely delayed, it was gone forever. "Mom, breathe," Jessica whispered, her own voice trembling as she reached out to touch Cynthia's shoulder. "Do not touch me," Cynthia hissed, pulling away as if her daughter's fingertips were laced with venom. I sat directly across the table, watching the empire they had built on my subjugation crumble into ash. For 32 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of their disapproval. I had endured the subtle insults, the blatant favoritism, and the endless conditioning that taught me to view myself as an administrative error in their perfect family portrait. That weight had multiplied 1,000-fold on the day I buried my son, anchoring me to the freezing mud of the Milford Cemetery. As I watched my sister realize the totality of her ruin, the phantom weight of that graveyard dirt finally washed off my shoulders. My posture relaxed, the persistent ache behind my ribs, a physical manifestation of my grief and fury, began to dissolve. I felt light. I felt an undeniable, hard-won peace settling into my bones. Caldwell, the trust administrator, adjusted his glasses. He reached across the table and pulled the signed confession toward his ledger. He examined the blue ink signature, comparing it to the official documents in Jessica's file. He nodded once, a sharp, definitive motion. "The executor recognizes the violation of Section 8, Caldwell stated, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel striking wood. "The accounts associated with the petitioner are hereby frozen, pending a formal reallocation of the assets. This mediation is concluded." Jessica stood up, her chair tipped backward, striking the wall behind her. She looked at me, her eyes wide and frantic, searching for the submissive, apologetic shadow she had bullied her entire life. She found only a woman made of steel. She opened her mouth to speak, to hurl an insult, or perhaps to beg, but no sound emerged. She turned and fled the boardroom, leaving her mother gasping for air at the table. I remained seated, methodically gathering my documents and placing them back into my leather portfolio. I had executed the financial decapitation perfectly. I had utilized the law, their own greed, and the infallible memory of my grandfather to strip them of the wealth they prized above all else. Yet, as I walked out of the glass building and stepped into the humid Connecticut afternoon, my strategic mind shifted to the next horizon. The legal battle was effectively over. Jessica was destitute on paper, and the criminal investigations would soon follow. But socialites do not die when their bank accounts run dry. They survive on perception. Jessica still retained her pristine public image. She still possessed 14,000 sympathetic followers on social media. She still held her status as the guest of honor for the upcoming Westport Hospital Charity Gala, where she planned to leverage her fabricated grief into enduring social capital. She would undoubtedly construct a new narrative, painting herself as the victim of a ruthless legal technicality orchestrated by a jealous sister. Financial ruin was the penalty for her greed, but true justice demanded something far more profound. The world needed to see the monster hiding behind the designer mourning veil. How do you burn a carefully curated social facade to the ground when the architect is preparing to take center stage? The aftermath of the probate mediation did not manifest as a sudden, explosive collapse. In the rarefied air of Connecticut high society, financial ruin creeps in with agonizing slowness. The trust administrator forwarded the boardroom transcripts to federal regulators, initiating a quiet, bureaucratic investigation into wire fraud. But indictments require months of meticulous accounting to secure. Behind closed doors, Jessica and Bradley were hemorrhaging. Their credit lines froze. Their attorneys demanded exorbitant upfront retainers. My mother shuttered her Greenwich design firm under the cover of a sudden early retirement. Yet, to the outside observer, the Perez family remained an untouchable pillar of coastal wealth. Narcissists do not retreat when their private reality collapses. They construct a louder, brighter public fiction. Desperate to maintain the illusion of their status while the probate investigation quietly suffocated them, Jessica doubled down on her social currency. If she could no longer rely on inherited wealth, she would rely on the loyalty of her husband's high-net-worth investors. She needed to project unshakable stability. She needed a stage. She found her platform on the 10th of June. Every summer, the Westport Hospital hosted an elite charity gala to benefit the neonatal intensive care unit. It was the pinnacle of the local philanthropic calendar. Tickets cost $2,000 a plate. The guest list functioned as a registry of the most influential political and corporate figures in the state. Through aggressive maneuvering and her husband's prior financial donations, Jessica secured the position of the evening's guest of honor. I sat at my billing desk during my lunch break, staring at the digital flyer emailed to all hospital staff. The event was titled A Night of Healing. Centered on the screen was a high-resolution photograph of my sister. She wore a soft pastel gown, gazing thoughtfully into the distance. The accompanying text praised her resilience in the face of profound family tragedy, noting her dedication to honoring her late nephew. The sheer audacity of the campaign possessed a chilling brilliance. She was utilizing the very hospital ward where my son took his final, struggling breaths to launder her decaying reputation. She intended to stand in front of 300 wealthy investors and harvest my grief, transforming the memory of the infant she attempted to defraud into a shield against her impending criminal charges. If she delivered a compelling performance, her husband's clients would remain loyal, providing the capital necessary to weather the coming legal storm. I closed the email. A legal victory was sterile. It punished the bank account but left the ego intact. Jessica viewed the law as a mere obstacle, a game of technicalities she had temporarily lost. To dismantle her permanently, I had to destroy the one asset she valued above all others. I had to annihilate her perception. I did not hire a public relations firm to counter her narrative. I did not draft a lengthy, emotional manifesto to post on social media. Truth, when delivered correctly, does not require a megaphone. It only requires irrefutable proof, presented at the precise moment the liar feels most invincible. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to a discount veterinary supply website. I scrolled past the surgical tools and the diagnostic monitors until I found exactly what I needed. It was a handheld, universal animal microchip scanner. It was constructed of cheap white plastic, featuring a single green activation button and a small liquid crystal display screen. I added the device to my cart. The total cost, including expedited shipping, was $45. The package arrived at my apartment 2 days later. I unboxed the scanner and held it in the palm of my hand. It was remarkably lightweight, no larger than a television remote control. I needed to verify its functionality. A malfunction on the night of the gala would reduce my strategy to a clumsy, embarrassing failure. I walked down the back stairwell of my building and stepped into the humid alleyway. A stray tabby cat frequently slept near the brick retaining wall, surviving on the dry food I occasionally left in a plastic bowl. The cat was resting in a patch of afternoon sunlight. I approached slowly, crouching down to avoid startling the animal. I pressed the green button on the scanner. The device emitted a low hum. I passed the plastic wand gently over the space between the cat's shoulder blades. A sharp, electronic beep pierced the quiet alley. I looked at the small digital screen. A 15-digit sequence illuminated against the gray background, followed by the contact information for a local animal rescue shelter. The technology was flawless. The $45 piece of plastic possessed the power to read the hidden, undeniable identity of any creature bearing a chip. I slid the device into my coat pocket and returned to my apartment to prepare for the evening. The night of the 10th of June arrived with a clear, starless sky. I did not purchase a new gown for the occasion. Vengeance does not require sequins or elaborate tailoring. I went to my closet and selected a simple, elegant black dress. It was the same dress I had worn to my son's funeral. The fabric carried the memory of the freezing cemetery wind and the scent of the bitter earth. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot. I applied minimal makeup. I looked into the mirror and saw a woman stripped of every illusion, armed with nothing but cold, absolute certainty. I placed the white plastic scanner into a small, unstructured, black clutch. I left my apartment and drove toward the country club hosting the hospital gala. When I arrived at the venue, the circular driveway was congested with imported luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts darted between idling sports cars. Through the towering glass windows of the Crystal Ballroom, I could see the glittering chandeliers illuminating a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer silk. 300 of the most wealthy, influential individuals in Connecticut were gathering to drink champagne and applaud a sociopath. Because I was a hospital employee, I bypassed the main guest registry. I utilized my staff identification badge to enter through the catering corridor, slipping past the busy waitstaff preparing the silver serving trays. I stepped into the shadows near the heavy velvet curtains framing the main stage. The ambient noise of the ballroom washed over me, a chaotic symphony of clinking crystal and polite laughter. Jessica was preparing to take the stage. She was about to perform the greatest role of her life, securing her financial survival through a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She thought the war was over. She thought the only threat to her existence was a slow-moving probate court docket. I stood in the darkness, my thumb resting against the smooth green button inside my clutch. 300 influential people were about to celebrate a lie. What happens when the lights go down and the truth finally steps out of the shadows? The Crystal Ballroom radiated a suffocating warmth generated by 300 bodies wrapped in silk and worsted wool. I stood motionless behind the heavy velvet drapes flanking the main stage. From my concealed vantage point, the pinnacle of Connecticut high society looked like a gilded cage. Waitstaff in starched white uniforms navigated the crowded floor, balancing silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and caviar tartlets. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and the unmistakable metallic tang of corporate anxiety. Tonight was not a genuine charity event. It was a financial lifeline disguised as philanthropy. The centerpiece of the evening was a high-tech silent auction. In the past, guests wrote their names on paper bid sheets. Tonight, the hospital administration utilized a proprietary mobile application. Guests linked their bank accounts to the software, allowing them to place bids directly from their smartphones in real time. The items up for auction were displayed on illuminated pedestals near the entrance. I had reviewed the digital catalog earlier in the week. Most of the offerings were predictable luxury items. A weekend retreat in Martha's Vineyard, a private wine tasting in Napa Valley, but one item stood out, carefully selected by the guest of honor to maximize public sympathy. Resting on a velvet cushion inside a glass display case was the pale yellow baby blanket. It was the exact knitted fabric my mother had crafted. It was the same blanket I had dropped at Jessica's estate as a fake peace offering. The same blanket she had draped over the neck of her golden retriever puppy while she laughed about my dead child. Now, Jessica had donated the item to the hospital, framing it as a sacred family heirloom she was bravely parting with to raise funds for the neonatal intensive care unit. It was a grotesque manipulation of my son's memory, engineered to extract applause and capital from her husband's wealthy investors. As the evening progressed, the digital auction went live. I stood in the shadows, holding my phone. I had created an anonymous user profile on the auction application. I watched the bid history for the yellow blanket. An initial bid of $500 appeared on the digital ledger. Jessica immediately countered with $1,000. She intended to buy her own stolen prop, effectively donating to the hospital to cement her status as the ultimate altruist. She expected the crowd to politely step aside once they saw her name leading the board. She did not anticipate a ghost in the system. I tapped my screen and submitted a bid of $2,000. Jessica was sitting at the head table. I watched the glow of her smartphone illuminate her face. A brief flash of irritation crossed her features before she typed a new number, 3,000. I countered with 5,000. I was playing a dangerous game of financial chicken. I did not possess the capital to pay the invoice if I won the auction. But I knew the precise architecture of my sister's ego. She could not afford to lose this public relations battle. If a stranger won the heirloom, her narrative of noble sacrifice would collapse. She needed to stand on that stage holding the yellow yarn to complete her performance. The numbers escalated rapidly, 7,000, 8,000. When the auction timer reached the final 60 seconds, I submitted a bid of $9,500. Jessica's husband leaned over, whispering urgently into her ear. He knew their credit lines were frozen due to the probate investigation. He knew a $10,000 expenditure would trigger severe alarms with their accountants. But Jessica ignored him. She could not stomach the optics of defeat in a room filled with their creditors. Her thumb struck the screen. $10,000. The timer expired. The application declared her the winner. I locked my phone and slid it back into my clutch. I had just forced my sister to bleed $10,000 of her dwindling liquidity to purchase a blanket she had already stolen. A hush fell over the ballroom as the hospital administrator approached the podium. He tapped the microphone and introduced the guest of honor, speaking of her profound resilience in the face of family tragedy. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Jessica rose from her seat. She walked toward the stage with measured, deliberate steps. She carried the yellow blanket in her hands, holding it delicately as if it were spun from glass. She stepped up to the microphone, adjusting the stand to accommodate her height. The applause faded into a respectful, expectant silence. "Thank you," Jessica said, her voice trembling with practiced vulnerability. "This evening represents a journey of healing for my family. This blanket was crafted with love for a life that ended far too soon. Tonight, I purchased it back because the funds will go toward saving other fragile lives. I want this fabric to serve as a symbol of hope and enduring family legacy." She raised the yellow yarn toward the ceiling. Camera flashes erupted across the room, capturing the defining image of her fabricated martyrdom. "This is for our Leo," she whispered into the microphone. A collective sigh washed over the audience. Several guests reached for cloth napkins to dab at their eyes. Jessica smiled through her fake tears. Looking out at the sea of investors, she believed she had secured her salvation. She believed the standing ovation would wash away the probate investigation and restore her empire to its former glory. I reached into my clutch and retrieved my mobile phone. Earlier in the week, I had enlisted the help of a former colleague from the Hospital Information Technology Department. He had provided me with the remote access credentials for the ballroom audio-visual system. I bypassed the security firewall with a single touch. Jessica opened her mouth to deliver her closing remarks. She never spoke the words. I tapped the override command on my screen. Every light in the crystal ballroom cut out instantly. The grand crystal chandelier went dark. The illuminated centerpieces faded to black. 300 guests were plunged into total, blinding darkness. The sudden absence of light triggered a wave of startled gasps. Before the panic could escalate, I engaged the secondary command. The state-of-the-art surround sound speakers suspended from the acoustic ceiling hissed to life. I did not play a recorded voice. I did not broadcast a video. I played a raw, unfiltered audio file I had extracted directly from the hospital diagnostic archives. A rhythmic, mechanical sound began to echo through the darkness. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow. It was labored. It possessed a haunting, metallic resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. The rhythm was uneven, the sound of a fragile mechanism struggling against an inevitable failure. It was the exact audio recording of my son's heartbeat from the neonatal intensive care monitor during his final hour of life. The deep, agonizing pulse filled the cavernous room, drowning out the murmurs of the confused high society guests. Thump, thump, thump. The crowd shifted in the dark, their confusion mounting with every heavy beat echoing from the speakers. They did not understand the sound, but the primal rhythm triggered a deep, visceral unease that settled over the ballroom. Jessica stood paralyzed at the podium, her hands still clutching the stolen yellow blanket in the pitch-black room. The heartbeat grew louder, a relentless demand for attention. The audience searched the shadows, wondering what the noise meant and who was about to emerge from the velvet curtains. The rhythmic pulsing of the fetal heart monitor enveloped the pitch-black room. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the desperate, failing labor of a damaged organ fighting for oxygen. The low bass frequencies vibrated through the polished hardwood floors, traveling up through the soles of 300 pairs of expensive shoes. The polite murmurs of the elite attendees died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, collective dread. Standing in the shadows, I watched the silhouette of my sister at the podium. She was frozen. Her hands gripped the edges of the wooden stand. She recognized the rhythm. She had never visited the neonatal ward, but the fundamental reality of the sound was unmistakable. Then the heartbeat lowered in volume, transforming into a steady, haunting metronome. A new audio track sliced through the darkness. It was crisp, devoid of static, carrying the acoustic signature of a high-vaulted ceiling. That dog is more of a Perez than her bastard baby ever was. The words blasted from the towering surround sound speakers. The pitch and cadence belonged undeniably to Jessica. There was no room for misinterpretation. It was not a sentence spoken in grief. It was an ugly, casual sneer delivered between sips of wine. A synchronized gasp rippled across the crystal ballroom. It was the sound of 300 illusions shattering simultaneously. Before the shock could settle, the primary projector ignited. A blinding rectangle of stark white light flooded the space behind the podium. The giant digital display screen, originally intended to showcase fundraising goals, illuminated the stage in a harsh, clinical glare. I had programmed the visual presentation to be undeniable. The screen was divided into two distinct columns. On the left side rested a scanned copy of a county medical examiner report. The header bore the official seal of the state. Below the seal, the patient name read, Leo Perez, infant. The fields detailed a tragic timeline of respiratory failure and final cessation of life. On the right side rested a veterinary intake form from an upscale local clinic. The patient name also read Leo Perez, canine. The dates highlighted in bright yellow ink told the entire story. The veterinary acquisition occurred mere hours before the infant's time of death. It laid bare the timeline of the fraud. It proved to every investor, politician, and socialite in the room that their beloved guest of honor had engineered a financial scheme on the deathbed of her own nephew. The crowd began to murmur, a low tide of outrage and revulsion sweeping through the tables. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet drapes. I did not carry a microphone. I did not prepare a righteous monologue. Words were the currency my sister used to manipulate the world. I traded in irrefutable data. I walked across the polished stage. The harsh white light from the projector cast long, distorted shadows against the walls. The silence in the ballroom deepened as the attendees caught sight of me. They recognized my face from the periphery of Jessica's curated family photographs. They saw the woman she had painted as an unstable, grieving liability. Bradley, my brother-in-law, had brought the golden retriever to the edge of the stage earlier in the evening to serve as a visual prop for the finale. The animal sat obediently on the carpeted steps, its thick coat gleaming under the ambient light of the projection screen. The dog thumped its tail against the floor upon seeing me, remembering the woman who had knelt beside it days prior. I walked directly past the podium. I did not look at Jessica. I could hear her breathing in shallow, ragged bursts. Her pristine facade had disintegrated. She was staring out at the sea of her peers, watching their expressions shift from adulation to profound disgust. I approached the golden retriever. I reached into my small black clutch and withdrew the cheap white plastic scanner. I knelt on the carpeted stairs, my black dress pooling around my knees. I pressed the flat edge of the device against the thick fur at the base of the animal's neck. I pushed the green activation button. A sharp electronic beep pierced the quiet of the ballroom. The sound triggered the final phase of the digital override I had programmed. The dual medical records on the giant screen vanished. In their place, a single web page rendered in towering resolution. It was the official, federally recognized registry database of the American Kennel Club. The 15-digit microchip sequence I had just scanned populated the search bar in real time. The database refreshed, pulling the permanent legal record associated with the animal. The text populated the screen in dark, unforgiving characters. The registered owner was listed as Allison Perez. The official registered name of the animal did not read Leo. The name displayed in 10-foot-tall letters read, Jessica's Debt. I stood up, sliding the scanner back into my purse. The reaction from the audience was not cinematic. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. High society operates on the principles of association and self-preservation. When a prominent figure is exposed as a liability, their peers do not attack. They simply erase them. A man seated at the front table stood up. He was the chief executive of a regional equity firm, the primary investor funding Bradley's latest commercial real estate venture. He set his untouched champagne flute onto the linen tablecloth. He offered his wife a silent nod, adjusted his suit jacket, and turned his back on the stage. He walked toward the exit. His departure acted as a catalyst. The illusion of politeness evaporated. A second couple stood, followed by an entire table. Chairs scraped against the hardwood. The quiet, synchronized exodus of Connecticut elite began. They were fleeing the epicenter of a toxic scandal, desperate to distance their own portfolios from a family that had just committed documented trust fraud in front of 300 witnesses. Bradley stood near the front row, his face drained of color. He reached out to intercept his chief investor, but the man walked past him without breaking stride or making eye contact. Bradley's corporate empire was evaporating in real time, the collateral damage of his wife's unyielding greed. I turned my attention to Jessica. She remained anchored behind the wooden podium. Her pastel gown suddenly looked absurd. Her hands trembled rapidly as she clutched the yellow baby blanket, the stolen prop that had ultimately secured her downfall. She was staring at the empty chairs, watching her entire universe collapse into nothingness. I did not smile. I did not offer a final, triumphant insult. The silence of her ruined kingdom was far more devastating than any sentence I could construct. I walked off the stage, descending the side stairs and slipping back into the catering corridor. I walked out the rear service exit, leaving the chaotic remnants of the charity gala behind me. The cool night air hit my face, carrying the faint scent of the nearby ocean. The destruction was total. My sister was socially annihilated, her husband was financially marooned, and the trust administrator was already drafting the paperwork to formally execute the poison pill clause. The inheritance they had tried to steal from my child was permanently out of their reach. The grandfather's estate, totaling over $2 million, was now legally mandated to revert back to the primary holding account. Due to the punitive structure of the charter, I was about to become the sole remaining heir in good standing. I unlocked my Honda Civic and sat in the driver's seat. I placed my hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the dark parking lot. I had won the war. But what does a grieving mother do with the millions of dollars she just extracted from the ruins of her own family? 6 months is a long span of time in the lifespan of a public scandal, but it is a remarkably brief window for a financial empire to bleed to death. November arrived in Connecticut with a biting frost that turned the coastal foliage brittle and gray. I parked my Honda Civic across the street from the towering wrought iron gates of the estate my sister used to rule. The metal gates stood wide open, propped apart by heavy canvas moving blankets and wooden dollies. I did not exit my vehicle. I sat behind the steering wheel with the engine turned off, listening to the ticking of my car heater, watching the consequences of her choices manifest in real time. A fleet of industrial moving trucks occupied the circular driveway. Men in heavy work jackets carried the physical evidence of Jessica and Bradley's curated life out the front door, loading the items into the dark caverns of the cargo bays. I watched them carry out a custom velvet sofa. I watched them haul away the towering crystal vases, the imported dining room table, and the expensive outdoor patio heaters. The federal wire fraud investigation initiated by the trust administrator had acted as a financial guillotine. It did not matter that Jessica ultimately avoided prison time through a grueling, humiliating plea agreement that stripped her of her civic standing. The mere existence of the public indictment triggered a lethal chain reaction. Bradley's high net worth investors, the men and women who had walked out of the charity gala in unified disgust, withdrew their capital within 72 hours. The commercial real estate firm collapsed under the weight of sudden insurmountable debt. Their corporate credit lines froze. Foreclosure notices and property liens replaced the elegant dinner party invitations in their mailbox. Through the large, uncurtained picture window of the den, I could see my sister. Jessica stood in the center of the barren room. She wore a faded gray sweater, her arms crossed tight against her chest to ward off the chill of a house that could no longer afford adequate heating. The plush, imported rugs were gone, exposing the cold, echoing expanse of the bare hardwood floors. She looked diminished, staring at the empty walls of a residence that legally belonged to a holding bank. There was no audience left to manipulate. There were no cameras to capture a tragic performance. She had traded her family for a fortune she could not keep, and now she was left with nothing but the hollow acoustics of her own ruin. The golden retriever did not share in her downfall. A domestic animal is an innocent creature, inherently incapable of understanding the cruel human agendas it is forced to participate in. Weeks before the bank seized the property, knowing Jessica could no longer afford the specialized care the animal required, I contacted a private rescue organization operating out of Portland, Maine. I arranged a discreet transport. The retriever now lived on a sprawling coastal farm with a family who owned 3 acres of fenced pasture. They did not care about aristocratic pedigrees or trust fund loopholes. They renamed him Buster. He spent his days chasing tennis balls in the salt air, liberated from his role as a fraudulent pawn. My mother, Cynthia, met a similar, albeit self-inflicted, fate of quiet isolation. Her Greenwich interior design firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in late August. Deprived of the $2.1 million inheritance she had banked her entire identity upon, she retreated entirely from the public eye. She moved into a small rented condominium in a neighboring, less affluent town. She stopped calling my phone. I stopped waiting for the screen to light up. The silence between us was no longer a weapon she wielded to enforce compliance. It was just a quiet, permanent boundary wall. I put my car in gear and drove away from the gated community. I felt no urge to roll down the window or offer a parting insult. Gloating requires a desire to engage, and I was finished engaging with ghosts. I navigated the familiar route toward the coastline, letting the steady hum of the tires guide my thoughts. The activation of the poison pill clause within my grandfather's charter had executed a profound redistribution of wealth. By legally stripping Jessica of her standing, the estate executor followed the strict, unyielding parameters of the 1998 document. The capital bypassed her tainted lineage and funneled directly into the only remaining compliant channel, the primary holding account, containing the entirety of the $2.1 million estate transferred into my sole legal control. A lesser person might have taken that immense capital and purchased a new, lavish reality. They might have bought a sprawling house on the water, a luxury vehicle, and paraded their newfound status in front of the relatives who had spent decades shunning them. But doing so would validate the very disease that infected the Perez family. It would mean accepting the premise that accumulated money equates to human worth. I refused to let their dirty currency define my son. I met with attorney David Sterling in early October. We drafted a new legal entity. We established the Leo Perez Memorial Foundation, structuring the organization as an irrevocable charitable trust. I authorized the transfer of every single cent of the $2 million into the foundation accounts. We designated the funds to directly support the neonatal intensive care unit at Westport General Hospital, providing immediate, unquestioned financial relief for single mothers facing catastrophic medical bills. Nurse Sarah Jenkins, the woman who had documented my sister's initial deception, accepted a permanent seat on the board of directors. The money was weaponized to build safety nets for women walking the exact terrifying path I had walked, alone. My drive ended at the wrought iron gates of the Milford Cemetery. The afternoon sun hung low in the pale sky, casting long, stark shadows across the manicured lawns. The coastal wind whipped through the barren branches of the oak trees, carrying the distinct, sharp chill of approaching winter. I stepped out of the vehicle and zipped my heavy wool coat against the cold. I walked along the asphalt path, my boots crunching over fallen, dry leaves, until I reached the small, quiet section near the eastern perimeter. The grave was no longer a mound of raw, disturbed earth. The grass had grown back over the summer, thick and green, blanketing the soil in a protective layer. A simple, elegant mahogany marker rested at the head of the plot. It bore his name, his dates, and a single engraved dove. I stood at the edge of the stone, occupying the exact spot where my sister had leaned into my ear 6 months prior to announce her theft. The air today was free of vanilla perfume. It smelled only of frost and damp pine needles. I reached deep into the interior pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against a stiff, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out and held it up to the fading light. It was a certified cashier's check. It was the physical draft of the $2.1 million settlement printed by the trust administrator prior to my execution of the electronic transfer to the charitable foundation. It was a voided, symbolic piece of paper bearing the sum total of my family's lifelong obsession. This was the paper my mother had sacrificed her soul to acquire. This was the number my sister had traded her humanity to steal. It looked incredibly fragile, vibrating in the cold November wind. I reached into my opposite pocket and retrieved a silver metal lighter. I flicked the steel wheel with my thumb. A bright orange flame flared to life, burning steady and hot against the gray, muted backdrop of the cemetery. I held the bottom corner of the heavy paper over the flame. The edge curled inward, browning rapidly before catching fire. The fire consumed the bank routing numbers. It devoured the printed zeros. I held the check until the heat licked dangerously close to my bare fingertips. Then I let the burning remnants drop onto the frosted grass. I stood in the profound silence of the graveyard and watched the fire reduce the paper to carbon. A sudden gust of wind swept across the lawn. The delicate black ash lifted into the air, swirling briefly before scattering over the cold Connecticut earth, vanishing into the landscape. I looked down at the mahogany marker. I felt the enduring, heavy ache of a mother who outlives her child. But the blinding anger was gone. The poison had been drawn out and discarded. To my mother and my sister, wealth was the only metric of existence. To me, the villain's money was rubbish. My son's peace was the only thing that mattered. The thud of frozen earth striking my infant son's casket still echoes in my mind. It's a sound that irrevocably fractured my reality, a stark dividing line between the life I knew and the one I was forced to forge. Standing there in the freezing March wind at that Milford cemetery, the grief was a physical weight. Yet, it was the sharp, manufactured scent of vanilla perfume and the chilling whisper from my sister, Jessica, that truly anchored the horror. She hadn't come to mourn. She had come to announce a theft. Naming her newly purchased golden retriever Leo after my buried son wasn't a bizarre act of misdirected mourning. It was the calculated opening move in a scheme to exploit a $2.1 million trust fund loophole. In that moment, surrounded by relatives performing their practiced sorrow, the truth crystallized to my family. My son was never a person to be mourned. He was an administrative hurdle, a financial opportunity wrapped in a tragedy. Looking back on the surreal, terrifying year that followed the hidden wiretaps, the HR ambushes orchestrated to starve me financially, the cold psychological warfare, and the blinding exposure at the hospital charity gala, I see a narrative that extends far beyond a single family's betrayal. I see a devastating reflection of a specific, insidious sickness within American culture. It's a sickness that occurs when a family replaces intrinsic worth with the hollow metric of social currency. My mother, Cynthia, was the master architect of this dysfunction. She constructed a life in Westport where image was paramount, and reality was whatever she decided it should be. Jessica, the real estate socialite with the perfect smile, was the golden child because she shined brighter in the public eye. I, the medical billing clerk, was the shadow, the administrative error, expected to apologize simply for existing. This is the perilous trap of prioritizing social currency in parenting. When children are treated as mere props for a pristine public image, love becomes entirely conditional. It becomes tethered to achievements, appearance, and the ability to garner applause. If we wish to raise children who are truly successful, loved, and ethically grounded, we must vehemently reject this obsession with perception. The foundation of a healthy family structure requires an unwavering commitment to honesty and fairness. It demands creating an environment where a child's intrinsic worth is absolute and never in question. True success isn't quantified by liquid assets, the size of a home, or a lavish lifestyle. It is the arduous, quiet development of a resilient and ethical character. My sister and mother viewed my son's funeral not as a tragedy, but as a lucrative business opportunity. They were willing to commit federal wire fraud, laughing over expensive wine while declaring that the dog is more of a Perez than her bastard baby ever was. This grotesque level of greed is not spontaneous. It is the culmination of decades of unchecked narcissism, a survival strategy built on curating a brighter public fiction to conceal a collapsing, morally bankrupt private reality. They survived on perception because truth was something they could no longer afford. From a spiritual perspective, the poison pill embedded in my grandfather's trust, the clause that stripped any heir of their share for attempting fraud, is a powerful metaphor. It illustrates the inherently self-destructive nature of greed. When the human heart focuses solely on material gain, it invariably loses its humanity. My family was so consumed by their desperation for a $450,000 bailout that they blindly walked into a trap of their own making, sacrificing their entire inheritance on the altar of their avarice. This harrowing journey underscores the vital importance of cultivating emotional awareness, wisdom, and profound fortitude. The path to wisdom, I learned, is rooted in self-correction. My route to justice was not paved with hysterical confrontations or screaming matches. It was built on a foundation of meticulous, cold clarity and the rigorous discipline of separating emotional narratives from empirical evidence. When my sister weaponized the court system to have me declared mentally unfit, I didn't collapse into the role of the hysterical victim. I presented the psychiatrist with cold, undeniable proof of her sociopathic tendencies. Willpower, true grit, isn't always loud. Often, it is found in the perfectly still silence you maintain while your adversaries hang themselves with their own arrogance. I didn't seek to outspend them. I let their own lack of ethics be their undoing. If there is a core truth to be drawn from the ashes of the Perez family, it is that a better life is not found in millions of dollars. When the $2.1 million estate finally reverted to my control, I refused to let that dirty currency define my son's legacy. I didn't purchase a waterfront mansion or luxury cars to gloat. Instead, I established a foundation, donating every cent to the hospital's NICU ward to support struggling mothers. This was the ultimate rejection of my family's twisted value system. It was a declaration that money is truly rubbish compared to the peace of one's soul. The peace that finally settled into my bones was the only victory that mattered. To guide children toward becoming healthy and successful adults, parents must lead by profound example. We must prioritize our own moral and ethical standing over status and the fleeting illusion of perception. We must teach our children to value truth over lies, even when the lie is draped in designer silk and celebrated by society. This journey has irrevocably reshaped my understanding of family, responsibility, and the true weight of a legacy. If you have ever felt the crushing expectation of a family that demanded you shrink yourself to fit their narrative, I understand. If this story resonates with you, if it stirs something familiar, please like, share, and subscribe to Savage Revenge Stories. We explore the profound, often painful realities of betrayal, survival, and the cold, unyielding power of the truth. As I stood at Leo's grave on that final, crisp November afternoon, watching the voided $2.1 million settlement check burn, I didn't feel the thrill of a conqueror. I felt the profound, enduring ache of a mother who had outlived her child. But the blinding anger was finally gone. The goal is never to win at all costs. The goal is to reach a place where you can watch the black ash of material obsession drift away on the wind, knowing that your peace is all that matters. I had finally stopped asking for permission to exist correctly. I had drawn out the poison. And perhaps, as you look at the landscape of your own life, you might wonder, what illusions are you holding on to? And what might happen if you finally let them burn?